Hello and welcome to this episode of Keeping Up with Kendall. Hi, my name is Dr. Tony Cruz. I'm the campus president here at the Kendall Campus of Miami-Dade College, coming to you from Building R on the Kendall Campus. And joining us today as our special guest is Jorge Plasencia. He is the CEO of Republica Havas. Jorge.
Hi, thank you,
Greetings.
Doctor. Thank you for having me here.
It's great to have you here.
Great to be back on campus. It's been a while.
Well, you're an alum, and it's great to have you on campus.
I am.
There's a lot of things I want to talk to you about, and a lot of questions I have for you. So let's go ahead and get into that.
Absolutely.
First and foremost, tell us a little about yourself, like where you grew up, where you went to school, that kind of thing.
So grew up in Miami. Was born here. My family, like a lot of us, exiled from Cuba, and my parents met here in Miami. My brother and I were both born here. Little boy, we lived. Went to school, St. Teresa. And then when I was in fourth grade, we moved to Miami Beach.
Oh, wow.
And went to school at St. Patrick's, which is a school on the beach. So I went there 4th through 8th grade. That's where I got involved in the service club, which then led me to do other things that we could talk about later. But then ended up going to LaSalle High School.
Okay.
And then graduated LaSalle. I was working in media already as throughout my time in high school. I started working as a gopher, as an intern at a radio station. So all throughout high school, worked there, and then ended up going to Miami-Dade College, and then ended up going to FIU. And long story of how this ended up happening, but ended up graduating from Barry University years later.
Okay.
So that's kind of my quick
story.
Quick story. There's a lot to it, but this is my quick story.
Well, that's great. Yeah, and so, you've been a big part of this community for a very long time. And I just want to, talk a little bit about, you're the CEO of Republica, and there's, and I know that you're also co-founder, right? So give us a little bit about how that came about. How did you come about creating that? What was the need? What did you see in our community that really, or just not just community, but maybe nationally, the need for that? So
as I was saying earlier, I started when I was in high school. My dad was a banker. He was with Republic National Bank, which was a big bank here in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. That when Cubans came over, the bank would lend money on a handshake to Cubans based on the credit they had in Cuba.
Wow!
So it was based on the credit you had in Cuba. If you always paid your loans and what have you in Cuba, that's how it started here in Miami. So it was called Republic National Bank. My dad was a banker in Havana, then here in Miami, and my dad's side, my family, I come from both sides, my mom's side and my dad's side, entrepreneurs. My dad's side, in the tobacco business in Pinal del Rio, Cuba.
Okay.
Today, there's still Plasencia cigars. That's my cousins. And then on my mom's side, my grandfather on my mom's side owned a soft drink company, owner of a soft drink company called Kawi in Cuba. I say that because I have kind of in my blood, my lineage.
It's running through you.
Entrepreneurship. I was a little kid, as I always say, with the lemonade stand outside my house.
Yeah.
So I started working at a radio station when I was there was the summer before freshman year of high school. My dad says to me one day that the bank was sponsoring a radiothon. They needed volunteers to answer the phones it was at Radio Mambi and Radio Ritmo. So they needed volunteers. So I go to this station to answer the phones, and like I say, back then walking into this radio station was like maybe walking into the Spotify offices today or Google, right? It was just, and radio still has a lot of energy, but back then it was like crazy.
It was the thing.
It was the thing, right? And I remember going home after volunteering there for the day and saying to my parents and my brother that I really loved the environment and the energy. And my brother said to me, you should ask for an internship one day. Fast forward, I ended up asking for an internship when I was in high school, ended up getting it, started my career on this path to where I am today. To answer your question, why this is important, because I worked in radio for many years, different radio companies, and did great things there. I then went to go work for at the time called the Florida Marlins. The Marlins, our radio stations had the Spanish language rights for the Marlins, Panthers, and Dolphins. So I was the guy in charge of liaising between the Marlins, Panthers, and Dolphins, Huizenga Holdings, and our radio stations.
Interesting.
I ended up getting hired away. In 1996, I was 22. I ended up getting hired away as the first director of Hispanic marketing for the Florida Marlins. Back then, if you remember, in 1996, the Marlins played at what was called Joe Robbie Stadium.
Yeah.
Joe Robbie Stadium, if you lived out here in Kendall, to get to Joe Robbie Stadium, it was a trek.
Yeah.
So to get fans to go to Marlins games back then was really hard. So I was brought in to really target and go after and speak to the Hispanic community in South Florida. Fast forward, ended up doing really well there. My time there, I was empowered. I was a kid, but I was empowered to do great work. I was going to school full time too. While I was there, going to college full time. I was lucky enough that the team, that was when we ended up winning the World Series in 1997.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
If you remember, after that, Mr. Heisinger, may he rest in peace, announces, "This is all great, but I'm going to sell the team."
Sell the team, right?
So I was the Herald reported back then. I was the first front office defector. I was the first person from the front office that left after that, because I remember saying, "Man, if I've been lucky enough to be part of this amazing, glorious team, I don't want to be part of as they dismantle it." So I ended up leaving. I had a great opportunity to go work for Gloria and Emilio Stefan at Stefan Enterprises as a right hand to them. Ended up being there a number of years, did amazing things, was part of Shakira's management team, did many different things.
Wow.
Then ended up going back to radio, but now at a national level, with a company that ended up becoming Univision Radio. And then was there, did great. But I always had that entrepreneurial bug, right? And I had learned from all these bosses I had in my career, what it was to own your own business. And I always wanted to do that. So in 2006, with a good friend, Luis Casamayor, who became my business partner, he and I had been talking about doing something together because there was we felt a multicultural shift happening in the United States. People like you, like me, that live, I call myself a 200%er, fully live my Anglo-American culture, yet I'm very tied to my
Our identities
my Latin
are
roots,
very complex, right? Very
exactly,
complex identities,
as Latinos, Hispanic Americans.
Yeah.
So I felt that there was an opportunity to market to people like myself, and that there was this white space to create an agency based in Miami that would not only work with multicultural audiences, but could also do general market work. So, we went off to start what we called Republica. My dad had passed away a few years prior in 2004. We started Republica in November of 2006. After my dad dies, my mom finds letters. My father tried getting into advertising. He was a banker at a CPA, but he tried getting into advertising. And that's a long story that I'll go into another day with you. But
yeah, sure.
We ended up naming it Republica in honor of Republic National Bank, where my dad worked for 30 years. So we start, and November of 2006, I'm not an economist like my father was, so little did I know the economy was gonna go the way it did with the Great Recession. But I'm proud to say, Dr. Cruz, that despite that, the agency grew every year. We grew every year, and we really stayed focused on growing and on building our business. And today, 15 years later, proud to say that we work with major South Florida brands like Baptist Health, Sedano's Supermarkets, and others. And nationally, we work with Walmart, Toyota, Google, Nike, and others. So it's exciting. We've built something special. We've also built, I feel, a great team. A great team of people.
Sure.
That 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago now, we merged with Havas, which is a global firm based out of Paris. So we're Havas's lead multicultural agency here in the United States. So we partner with them and work with them a lot on many efforts. So, thankfully, it's a long answer to your question, but thankfully it's gone well. But it hasn't been easy. Entrepreneurship. I know we're in the Mike Fernandez building here. He's the great example of a Cuban American entrepreneur, right? Entrepreneurship is not easy. It's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears every day. And people don't see a lot of the sausage making of how difficult it is sometimes to build a business, right? They only see kind of
the end result,
right? The end result, but kind of that day to day is not easy. But we've been really lucky to have amazing team members and some extraordinary clients that have believed in us over the years and that we've grown with.
Well, that's a great success story, and I think that the biggest part about all that, obviously all the effort that went into building that business, but you were also on the cutting edge, and now you're 15 years later, 16 years later, maybe others will see it and it's like, oh, that makes sense. But when you were doing it, where you thought about this idea, it wasn't, it made sense to you, but others were like, well, what does that even mean? You're right? I mean, it's something.
Absolutely, because, I think you kind of are, you kind of have your kind of your mindset on your goal and kind of your vision, right? But there's a lot of things that again, that people don't see, right? And I think that, any student that's watching us that wants to go into business and go into entrepreneurship, absolutely, I highly recommend it. But be ready for long days, long nights,
definitely,
and a lot of worry. And I remember the days when our CFO would come into my office and would say to me, "Hey, we have payroll next Friday, and this client hasn't paid, this client hasn't paid, this client hasn't paid. What do I do?"
Yeah.
Right? And you don't know the responsibility that comes with that until you're faced with that question from your CFO, where you're like, and then thankfully, we had great relationships with banks where we had lines of credit that we could cover, for those moments where, you're waiting for the receivables, for the clients to pay or for what have you. And, but the good news is, over the years, some way, somehow,
you did it.
We did it.
You did it.
Always netted out, and we did it, and here we are.
It's awesome. So what are some of the avenues or opportunities you see now for the agency? Like what's the future? Because you kind of predicted the future, 16 years ago as to what would happen, and you're being very successful in what you're doing. But what are some of the opportunities out there?
You know what, Dr. Cruz, there's still so much opportunity, because I find myself, you're an educator. I find myself as kind of an educator myself, in regard to, I was just in Dallas last week, speaking at a national franchise expo, right? And I was speaking to the power of the multicultural community and the multicultural consumer, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, there's still a lot of companies and brands that are not investing in these communities, right? That are not investing, and to me, it just doesn't make any sense, right? Because we have clients that will tell us that 50% of their growth over the next 5 years is going to come from multicultural communities across the country. But the fact that there's still brands that are not investing, it makes you shake your head, right? So what I find myself sometimes doing, or many times doing, is meeting with C-suites at big companies, meeting with boards of directors, meeting with brand managers, and kind of sharing the gospel of the opportunity, right? Because when you look at the sheer numbers, when you group together, what we call the multicultural communities in the U.S. is the U.S. Hispanic community, the African American Black community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community. When you look at those communities, right now they're about, give or take, about 40% of the population of the U.S.
Sure.
Think about that. Yeah. And if you're, again, speaking, let's say specifically to the Hispanic community, if you're not speaking to you and me and people like us in language, in culture, and it's not only about Spanish, it's about ways that resonate and that tug at our heartstrings, right? Yeah. And the other thing that's important is seeing ourselves represented in those campaigns, in those commercials. So it's something I enjoy doing a lot. Obviously, I'm passionate about it, and I think that a rising tide lifts all ships, and that as an industry we've come a long way, right? But there's still a lot to do and a lot to go. And the good news for us too, as Republica Havas here in Miami, is there's a certain allure now with Miami, right?
Definitely.
So whereas when we started 15 years ago, it was all about New York agencies or Boston agencies or Chicago or what have you. Today, more and more clients are open to speaking to an agency like us based on Coral Way, right? It's not only about Madison Avenue. And what's exciting about that is that I think they realize when they come to our office, we've got 25 nationalities on our staff. We're very international, and we bring that to our projects, right? We bring that international thinking and that kind of, and nothing against, obviously, any community, right? But I think that the more that you can be inclusive, the more that you can be understanding of what makes us tick as humans, and the more that you can that we can relate to what we connect with in content, I think the stronger that brand is going to connect, right? So that's what I get to talk about every day and what I enjoy doing.
That's really exciting stuff. And like I said, cutting edge, I think still to this day, 16
absolutely.
years later, because you got to keep on going.
Think about 15 years ago when we launched in 2006, it was the onset of social media.
Right.
Twitter launched that same year. Facebook, that was the year it reached, that Zuckerberg took it to the masses from college campuses. So in these 15 years, we've seen the evolution of how you reach consumers. You know, back then it was a one-way directional conversation. Today it's a two-way conversation. Today consumers can speak to brands and brands can speak back to consumers.
Yeah, definitely.
Right?
Very quick.
Very quick. And it's about that, right? And it's about, you know, when we first started, we didn't have a social media team. Now we have a huge social media team working with brands. Everything has evolved, right? Everything has evolved, and we, as an industry and us as a firm, we have to stay at the forefront of that evolution and make sure that we have, you know, the incredible minds. Because, like I say, my company, you know, whereas other companies that make widgets, you know, the machines are making the widgets.
Yeah.
We are, you know, our machine is human beings, right?
Right.
It's not robots, it's humans that are creating these campaigns.
And we're constantly evolving.
Absolutely.
Things keep on changing.
Absolutely.
So you've had tremendous success in the business world with the agency. But I know that also, because in your heart, and like you were talking about before, when you were even a teenager, you got involved in the community and wanted to be more part of the community. I know that you're a founder of Amigos for Kids, and that's a great organization that we partnered with as a college.
Thank you for that.
And so tell us a little bit about Amigos for Kids, what it is, and what led you to create that many years ago when you were a very young man.
Right. So I was 17 years old. I told you earlier, I gave a nod to when I was in grade school at St. Patrick's on Miami Beach. We had a service club. I got really involved with the service club. It was, I ended up becoming, when I was, I think, in the 7th grade, the president of the service club. And we would go volunteer at different homes for foster homes, right? Including we go to the Children's Home Society. And Dr. Cruz, I remember being a kid and thinking, man, I can't believe that these kids are, I didn't even know what abuse was, but once I understood what it was, I was like, you know, I come from a very loving home. Anyway, fast forward, I was working in radio, and I always stayed involved with Children's Home Society. I was working in radio and had, and was able to get involved with, we were involved with Children's Home Society, but with a group that we wanted to start, well, at the time, a Hispanic auxiliary of Children's Home Society. So we started in 1991 as Amigos of Children's Home Society. And at the time, you know, in the Hispanic community in Miami, we had La Liga contra el Cáncer, the League Against Cancer, but we didn't have too many organizations,
not too many,
philanthropic, right?
You're right.
So we were one of the few that started 30 years ago to really, you know, raise awareness in philanthropy and child abuse prevention, all that. So we started, Hurricane Andrew hit in '92. When Hurricane Andrew hit, there was so much need in South Florida, as you remember, that we had to pivot as an organization. And that's when we branched, we kept working with Children's Home Society, but we branched off and became Amigos for Kids. That was in '92. And ever since then, the organization, I genuinely believe, has been a jewel of this community, because we are there to help the most, you know, as I say, there's a dichotomy in Miami, right? We have some of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States, and we have some of the poorest zip codes in the United States. So we need the wealthy ones to help the poor ones, right?
Yes.
So that's where we're there, trying to connect those dots and trying to help these families that are such, you know, a lot of them are such great families, yet, you know, they live in poverty, you know. So Amigos is there to help these under-resourced families, but we're also there to fight child abuse. And, you know, we've been doing that now for 30 years. We have all sorts of programs, as you know. I'm proud to say that our president and CEO worked at Miami-Dade College for many years, Karina Pavone. She has done a fantastic job leading the organization. She started January, right before COVID. January 2020.
I remember that, because we were kind of, I kind of started a little bit before that here, so I remember meeting with her.
She started January 2020, and then COVID hit, but despite that, you know, she's done a really great job leading the organization. We have a phenomenal board, and Karina had big shoes to fill, because, you know, she was filling the shoes of Rosa Maria Plasencia, who was my cousin, who was our president and CEO, and unfortunately unexpectedly passed. but Karina has done such a fantastic job leading the organization and continuing Rosa's legacy and building her own legacy. I mean, to her credit, she's building her own legacy with her staff and with the board, and that's something that I'm very proud of, right?
We appreciate that. Yeah, we appreciate that collaboration and partnership with Amigos. Because the annual toy drive. I mean, there's so many other things, but it's so many other things, but so many things that are happening on an ongoing basis. And again, prevention of child abuse is a huge thing. It's very important for our community, and so I commend you for starting that.
And during the pandemic, unfortunately, the cases, because kids were home,
they were home more.
The cases, but unfortunately, the counselors and the teachers weren't seeing those kids in person, so they couldn't report a lot of the cases. So unfortunately, the pandemic didn't help in regard to child abuse, not only here in South Florida, but across the country. But I want to thank you. I want to thank you because you in your time here, you've really both in Hialeah and here, you've really supported us. And as I like to say, a lot of people see many times they'll see the big fundraisers, or they'll go to these events, but they don't see what's happening every day with our unsung heroes, which is our staff and our volunteers, every day working in the community.
Oh, yes.
And it's a phenomenal organization. Yes. It really is. Obviously, I'm biased.
Yeah, I know, but you're not. But I fully agree. I fully agree. It is great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, for creating that, and obviously still continuing to be part of that and supporting that cause.
I am committed to helping in any way. I'm now a proud board member, but it's nice to see that something that I was able to be a part of, starting with a small group of people, has taken on a life of its own, and hopefully will be around way beyond me, right, and any of us, which is what's special, right? That this organization, it's unfortunate that 30 years later we still need organizations like Amigos for Kids, but the reality is that as South Florida has grown, as Miami has grown, the need has grown deeper, right, than it even was 30 years ago. So there's definitely a need for organizations like ours and champions like yourself that support it. So thank you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah. So we've asked you some questions about your work history, your professional history, and your world in business and philanthropy and everything else. So we have an audience out there of students, community members, others that are watching us today. What are some words of wisdom that you have for them? What would you say to them? And with all your vast experience,
it's interesting, Dr. Cruz, because, I've had vast experience. I started working, as you all heard, when I was in high school, right? So it's been a long time, right? But I consider myself a lifelong learner, right? I never stop being curious, never stop learning, never stop evolving, never stop growing, right? And when I say growing, both professionally, but also personally, right? And I think the older you get, the more life goes kind of from that, only professional and physical, whatever, to also, growing spiritually, right? Just that evolution that life is. And I think, the more that one can evolve, right, and understand that none of us are perfect, that we're gonna make mistakes. But I had a boss when I was at Univision. I had a boss that, may he rest in peace, his name was Jerry Parencio, that he had 20 rules of the road, 20 rules that we as executives had to follow. And if you broke a rule, sometimes you would even get fined, like financially fined.
Wow.
Right? Yeah, and a number of people.
He meant business.
He meant business, but that's the thing, he meant business.
Yeah.
But one of the rules of the road was we all make mistakes, just don't make too many. And I think what's interesting about that statement is that we're all going to make mistakes.
Certainly.
Just learn from those, right? Learn from those and kind of take a moment to discern on, what could I have done differently at that moment, whatever the moment is, right? Whatever it is, and I think as I'm able to continue to live, thankfully, it's appreciating that, I think, is what has been important for me, and understanding that. Something else that I think that as I've grown older that I appreciate more is moments. Like this moment. Yeah. Like all of us together here. I'm never going to forget this moment, and I have to appreciate this moment, right? I think sometimes you live life going through the motions, but not stopping and appreciating the moments.
I totally agree.
And I think that's something else that I've learned, to truly appreciate that moment and appreciate what's going on at that moment, and what are the memories that you're going to take from that moment, and what are you going to learn from that moment, or how are you going to grow from that, grow from that moment.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry to get a little philosophical here.
But that's true. It's true. I think the younger when we're much younger, we don't think about that. We're thinking about the next day or the next year or the next 10 years. I don't know, whatever it is. Obviously, we all want to be goal oriented, but we always think about those goals and we forget about the day-to-day things and really appreciate those things as they happen. Because if we don't, then they go by, right? And we forget them.
And like I said, and you're going through the motions.
Yeah.
You're going through the motions of life. And don't get me wrong, it's good to go through the motions because that means you're Adrienne Arsht, who's a dear friend of my client. When people ask her the question of, how do you do everything you do and what you've done? And she says, I put one foot in front of the other.
Right.
And I think it's so, again, you stop and think about that line, you've got to keep going. You've got to keep going, and you've got to appreciate, what you're living and what you have ahead of you, right?
Yeah,
so I
definitely.
think that would be my
my
line. But always be a lifelong learner. I think that's important. Never stop learning. Never stop reading. Never stop, however you want to learn. Watching documentaries, whatever it is. However,
critical.
Podcasts, whatever it is. See, those weren't around 15 years ago.
No, they weren't around.
Yeah, so
there's a lot of things there. Yeah.
So whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
But never stop the journey of learning.
Well, those are great words of wisdom.
Oh, thank you.
And again, it was a pleasure having you here on Keeping Up with Kendall.
Yeah, it's great to be in Kendall.
Best wishes to you with everything that you do in the future.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for joining us today on Keeping Up with Kendall, and catch you next time.